Okay, welcome everybody to what I hope will be an interesting afternoon on cash and voucher assistance for clearance in land release and survival assistance, i.e. The use of cash and voucher assistance as or that modality in mine action. What we'll do this afternoon is hear from a series of speakers. I should introduce myself as your moderator this afternoon. My name is Richard McCormack. I have the privilege of joining you from Copenhagen today in this virtual environment. First time I find myself hosting a side event from a screen in a foreign capital. Let's see how that goes. I am the head of the Danish Refugee Council's Humanitarian and Disarmament section, formerly known as Danish Demining Group. I am by no means an expert on cash and voucher assistance or cash in the round, and for that we will turn to the Global Protection Cluster's task team that has been looking at this over the past many months in the shape of a report that was presented some months ago, conducted by Bill Marsden. So in a rather than me explaining everything, I will hand over in just a couple of minutes to Tenzin Manell, who's in charge of on behalf of the task team of running that piece of research to provide you with the background and introduction. We will then hear from Bill, who conducted the research itself, and then we will move on to Une, who is sitting interestingly with me in Copenhagen, and we'll talk about some of the Danish Refugee Council's experiences with cash and cash in relation to mine action programming from Afghanistan. And then we will go on to hand in hand with for aid and development with Kaiko Tamura, who will also look from her perspective at the area before we open up for questions, which I hope this afternoon's presenters will bring forth. So without further ado, I would like to hand the baton to you, Tenzin, to take it up and provide the background to the work in hand. I should just ask those of you that have questions to put them into the chat, and we'll try and monitor the chat and take questions as we get to the question and answer session, and we'll collect them there. So without further ado, over to you, Tenzin, and I hope that was good enough as an introduction. You have it.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Great. Welcome. Okay. Welcome everyone again. My name is Tenzin Manell, as was shared, and I'm Associate Director for Cash and Livelihoods with the Women's Refugee Commission. And as Richard pointed out, I also co-lead the Global Protection Cluster Task Team on Cash for Protection. My co-lead is Stefan Schmult of IRC. Cash and Voucher Assistance, or CVA, refers to cash transfers or vouchers to individuals, households, or communities for goods or services they need, such as food, hygiene or shelter items, medical expenses, and more. It's increasingly used by humanitarian actors to reach protection outcomes. Cash and voucher assistance offers choice and dignity to recipients, and it also strengthens local markets. As of yet, humanitarian mine action does not widely use cash and voucher assistance, but there's great potential here. Cash and voucher assistance can support explosive ordnance affected communities and survivors as an aspect of victim assistance during stages of treatment and recovery. I'll share some concrete examples here. Funeral support, cost of transportation to health facilities, cost of treatment and assistive devices, restarting livelihoods or transitioning to alternative livelihoods, tuition for school-age explosive ordnance survivors, and more. Today, I'm going to share with you a bit about the task team. I'll introduce the research on using cash and voucher assistance in support of achieving protection outcomes in mine action, and I'll also highlight the foundations we share across the cash and voucher assistance and mine action communities of practice to work together going forward, not to force cash and voucher assistance into mine action, but to leverage cash and voucher assistance as a tool to support explosive ordnance affected communities and survivors where appropriate. And I'll underscore where appropriate here because it's not always the case. Over the past 4 years, the task team has grown to 50 members strong across 30 agencies, including implementers and many donors. We focus on using cash and voucher assistance to achieve protection outcomes across all areas of responsibility. We support coordination, evidence generation, and guidance, tool and training, development, and rollout. Membership is open. We're always welcoming new members, so feel free to knock on my door. And we also always welcome colleagues who are not members but can share experience with our membership of implementing cash protection. We have mapped evidence, next slide please. We've mapped evidence on the use of cash and voucher assistance for protection outcomes across the Global Protection Cluster's areas of responsibility, beginning with child protection, then gender-based violence, recently housing, land, and property, and last year with support from SDC, mine action. By taking stock of evidence, we lay the foundation for generating more targeted evidence to address gaps. We make our way towards evidence-based practice and the uptake of cash and voucher assistance where appropriate within mine action. We're able to share with you today emerging practice and flag where further effort and resources are needed, including staff capacity and funding for programming. It's okay that cash and voucher assistance and mine action actors don't yet speak the same language. As we've seen with CVA and child protection and gender-based violence communities of practice, de-siloing ourselves across agencies or even within our very own agencies requires understanding each other's ways of working. It requires leadership, capacity building, resources, and time to get integrated programming right. But the key ingredient here is openness, a willingness to learn so that we can enhance each other's impacts and fulfill our humanitarian responsibility to do no harm. When we neglect cash and voucher assistance integrated within protection programming where it does make sense, that is to bridge the gap between service availability and service access, we're doing harm in not using all tools at our disposal. Next slide, please. The new draft International Mine Action Standard, IMAS 13.101 on victim assistance, encourages humanitarian mine action agencies to ensure that explosive ordnance survivors are informed of the services they need and have access to them. And it clarifies the expectation that humanitarian mine action agencies should support survivors if the state is unable to meet its responsibilities. Mine action teams in the field are beginning to transform the lives of explosive ordnance survivors using cash and voucher assistance, especially where the state is unable. When we look to the Mine Ban Treaty, the Oslo and Dubrovnik Plans of Action, the Grand Bargain, the Sustainable Development Goals, and commitments on disability inclusion, we can see clearly that the time to do more together is now. Thank you very much. I'll pass it back to you, Richard.
Okay, just bear with me to find the unmute button. Thank you, Tenzin, for that overview of of cash and instruction to it. What we'll do now is move on to the research itself, and this was going to form the bulk of this afternoon's presentation. So, Bill Marsden, I'd like to introduce and hand the baton to you. Bill will speak, I think, for of the order of 20-25 minutes or so with his coverage of the research project itself and its findings. So, thank you, Bill, and you have the word.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Richard, and thanks, Tenzin. It's a privilege and a pleasure to present the findings of this work today to the distinguished participants of this most important virtual annual event, and it's the home of Mine Action. So, as Tenzin has said, cash and voucher assistance for achieving protection outcomes in mine action, evidence mapping and recommendations is the fourth of a series of publications by the Global Protection Cluster Task Team on Cash Protection. I'd like to start by describing the ways we found cash and voucher assistance is already contributing to protection outcomes in mine action, and then flag some of the internal constraints that people talked about, perhaps partly explaining why adoption is slower here than in some other sectors. I'll flag where the drivers for its wider adoption are referenced, as Tenzin said, in the global commitments and the Oslo and Dubrovnik declarations, and in the broader humanitarian landscape, which encourages wider adoption of cash-based responses. I'll then introduce and discuss the gaps and suggestions for future research before talking through in detail the recommendations made for each of the stakeholder groups, and finish again by summarizing the recommendations and hopeful next steps for the Mine Action community to take. And hopefully in the coming months, teams of the organizations that are here today will feel comfortable to start or to take the next steps in working to improve the protection outcomes for particularly vulnerable people in all of the countries where we work. So this slide is the crux. It shows the examples of where cash and voucher assistance can improve protection outcomes through the main workflows of humanitarian mine action. Top row, in risk reduction, it can help high-risk taking groups and individuals to adopt an alternative livelihood. In many countries, firewood collectors, charcoal burners, scrap metal, and explosive collectors, or people that are just grazing animals, are some of the most frequent casualties of explosive ordnance. In other countries, farmers work land that could be contaminated. And ICRC have demonstrated where an alternative income grant allowed farmers to build greenhouses or farm livestock and leave the most dangerous land fallow. In land release, cash and vouchers can add value to the cleared land or support reducing systemic socioeconomic disadvantage. In Afghanistan, the German government supported DRC, DDG, to construct an irrigation scheme, bringing water to land near a village, allowing year-round planting of crops that could bring benefits to farmers on land that had been cleared, but also reducing the dependency on grazing livestock on land that hadn't been cleared yet and that was potentially dangerous. Cash and vouchers assistance could also support empowerment of marginalised families if, as part of a pre-clearance negotiation, communities agree to give access to part of a cleared land area to marginalised families. If they added cash for work, for tools, for seed, then they could really transform the lives of some of the poorest people living in the villages where mine action is undertaken. But in the third row, I think it's that in terms of victim assistance that cash and voucher assistance has been most widely used. Again, DDG, DRC, and ICRC are helping survivors in many different countries across all continents. Cash and vouchers assistance can support new explosive ordnance victims to quickly reach a medical facility just by paying for local transport. It can support the family to look after the patient as they get that treatment. And it can cover any services or medicines that are not free at the health facility. And it can continue to support that patient as they recover, as they're fitted with any necessary prosthesis and how they learn how to use them. And as I've said, it perhaps most importantly can support the retraining of survivors and allow them to re-enter the labour market, reintegrated as a contributing member of society through generating a livelihood for themselves. Given it can be so transformative, it was puzzling why cash and voucher assistance hasn't been adopted more widely within mine action. And we identified several constraints. And the first is the money. There is an apparent mine action donor prioritization of land release and explosive ordnance risk reduction, with less prioritization on resourcing victim assistance pillar of the treaty. That's led to the technical skills of mine action agencies historically focusing on the safe management of large numbers of clearance teams, achieving effective and efficient land release, and contributing towards the completion agenda and the delivery of community liaison and risk education. There's very little or no experience of resource transfer, which could include cash and voucher assistance. To some extent, there's also been a lack of organizational willingness by mine action agencies to directly support individuals or vulnerable groups in communities, expecting that other sectors and agencies would invest in the protection activities and the broader community-led support. And one of the fundamentals, as Tenzin mentioned, is that the historic lack of an IMAS standard on victim assistance, and consequently very few national standards. There's very little expectation for mine action agencies to conduct victim assistance or encourage linkages into protection mechanisms through partnerships with agencies with complementary skill sets, including cash and vouchers. The lack of engagement by mine action agencies to participate in global commitments towards the centrality of protection in humanitarian action, or to follow closely the human rights approach. This takes the shape of trends where management teams in countries focus on land release and risk education and repeatedly miss the broader opportunities for partnership or to develop in-house capacity to reach individuals in need of protection support and assistance. And there is a reluctance among mine action agencies to engage in victim assistance programs, and that relates perhaps to concerns of having to make long-term commitments in the face of stretched resources, a lack of bandwidth or lack of staffing capacity. As Tenzin's already covered, I think that the internal constraints exist. There are lots of reasons why this is a very good time for the wider adoption of cash and voucher assistance with the mine action sector. It could be a tool to help achieve some of the commitments that were agreed at the RevCon at Oslo, Dubrovnik. And if you look at the action plan from the Oslo Declaration, Action Point 6 encourages strengthening partnerships. Action Point 36 requests the provision of effective and efficient first aid and ongoing medical care for survivors of EO accidents. Action Point 38 exhorts ensure access to comprehensive rehabilitation services. And the point we'll come back to a bit later is 39, to ensure access to rural development and social protection programs, including in remote areas. So it was very exciting that as we were starting this research, we found that the draft IMAS Standard 13.1 asked the mine action sector, in addition to collecting the data and delivering the data into the National Mine Action Authority or the area of responsibility or the response, that operators take on the role as provider of last resort to make sure explosive ordnance accident survivors can access appropriate medical facilities. It's a major breakthrough. We just hope that that standard gets approved and released soon. Outside the mine action sector, on the broader humanitarian landscape, we've talked about the Grand Bargain, which is requesting in more widespread use of cash and responses. In 2018, British government made the policy on mainstreaming disability and inclusion into the development agenda. In 2020, the Sustainable Development Goals have frequent references to and applications that we could use cash better in mine action. The Secretary General's Assembly request to leave no one behind, and in UNMAS's strategic plan, 2019 to 23, Objective 3 is for national leadership, and 3.3 is operational capabilities for mine action become effective. If these new mine action standards could be adopted and rapidly become operationalized, it could be a game changer, especially for those survivors living in remote areas where the only visitors may be from the mine action sector. The study did identify gaps and it suggested a few areas for further research. And one of them is about data and the fact that in most humanitarian responses, the understanding of how many people have been injured doesn't feed clearly and easily into the response planning. With better data, it would be easier to allow advocacy for better support to survivors as part of the larger disabled target group. And particularly in the current conflicts, where the number of people being injured is known to be high, but it remains unquantified, it's very difficult to advocate for better resourcing of victim assistance. Research is also needed to analyse the extent in which cash and voucher assistance targeted to survivors can reduce negative coping mechanisms and to deliver sustained outcomes rather than just a welcome short-term lift. On another side, the understanding the complementarity between multi-purpose cash and specific cash assistance to achieve the protection of explosive ordnance survivors. Here we mean what is needed is an understanding of the additional support EO survivors may need to address the vulnerabilities caused by their injuries, above and beyond the allocation for medical support that might be available in a multipurpose grant. There's also the potential for cash and vouchers to support community-based rehabilitation, understanding the benefits of community-based recovery or rehabilitation in terms of optimizing community capacity and building community resilience. Research is needed to see where community-based rehabilitation could support people in EO-affected communities and see where and how cash and vouchers could assist without disrupting the volunteering and the strong social cohesion, which are characteristics of effective community-based rehabilitation. And I think we'll touch again on the fact that it would be very good to understand where the donor strategic positioning is towards victim assistance, mainstream inclusion, and the Grand Bargain commitments. Because this current prioritization of cost-efficient land release and reach of risk education misses the opportunities for supporting survivors of accidents. We would like to know if applying cash and voucher approaches as described in this report more widely would be attractive to traditional mine action donors and provide part of the answer of how mine action can deliver efficiently on the victim assistance pillar. There's also a lack of evidence on cash and vouchers promoting social cohesion and providing destigmatization of EO survivors. Ideally, we can identify programs and settings where this is happening, or we can encourage the piloting and development of small experiments, field experiments, to try and see where that could be adopted in mine action contexts. And this is such an exciting day to be presenting this to the forum at the NDM, where national mine action authorities, where the mine action areas of responsibility focal points are all here. And this is the biggest request I think that we could make is please can we accelerate the adoption of the IMAS 13.1 victim assistance, and as soon as it is, look at to review how this can be incorporated into mine action standards at the national level. If these national mine action agencies need support to prepare the SOPs, let's look at how that can be provided. And to encourage the adoption of cash and voucher assistance, if it's just to facilitate transport to emergency health facilities, if it's to cover initial costs of treatment, and it may be some subsistence of costs, to provide time for the activation of the case management structure in the country by the relevant protection agencies to carry on these vulnerable people through to a position of safety and empowerment. And in investing in building of local capacity for cash and vouchers within victim assistance organizations and local NGOs working with the affected communities. If all that can be done, then to work together to socialize the policy adoption of cash and vouchers as a useful approach in victim assistance and risk reduction programming in mine action, preparing best practice guidelines and training materials focused on how to use cash and vouchers to support protection outcomes in mine action. Then to socialize those guidelines internationally at events such as this to encourage early and widespread adoption. And to socialize the mine action interagency imperative to support explosive ordnance survivors, their families, and affected communities as a specific subset of cash and vouchers for protection outcomes. And ideally, forums like today next year will be able to increase the visibility of best practices of where service provision to vulnerable and affected individuals, groups and communities has allowed for the inclusion of EO survivors as a subset within the vulnerability assessments. Investing in processing that survivor data to quantify the relative importance with the other competing needs during a humanitarian response planning. And to up the coordination between protection, education and health, as well as cash working groups to advocate for better inclusion of survivors into referral pathways and for protection agency caseloads to ensure this service delivery reaches even the most remote areas which mine action agencies often work in. And hopefully, cash and vouchers can increasingly support the adoption of alternative livelihoods, of investigation of alternative livelihoods for the people that are most at risk of having an explosive ordnance accident, the risk-taking individuals and groups, to pilot how cash and vouchers can assist people to take an alternative livelihood, and that resourcing, preventing a problem before it happens, can be included in response plans and budgets. Overall, we hope that national mine action authorities and areas of responsibility can intensify efforts to support mine action and cash and voucher partnerships to make sure that those referral pathways reach to the most remote areas, and to support the dissemination and socialization of best practices and emerging examples that are producing good results quickly and into the more wider environment. If they can secure funding for developing evidence-based and knowledge sharing of cash and vouchers for protection in mine action in and across areas of operation, and facilitate that cooperation between the protection actors, the mine action actors, and cash and voucher experts to extend equitable access to protection referral mechanisms into those remote areas, and to identify and allocate resources to allow piloting of mine action, cash and vouchers cooperation to improve those protection outcomes. Today's a very good day, I hope, to mention the fact that it would be interesting to have a mine action donor consultation on the rollout plan for IMAS 13 and victim assistance, and whether that would support its more widespread resourcing, showing examples of where it works, showing examples where it reduces risk, and to look for a donor to at least make the commitment to support mine action agencies to get the survivors of accidents to the relevant health support until state services or the broader humanitarian community can take over. The good news for the mine action sector is that many of these pieces of the puzzle are already in place. Mine action agencies are well known for having really strong community liaison teams who work closely with communities throughout the deployment to any geographical area. They have close long-term relationships with governments at the national and at the local level, and they coordinate closely with governments and communities on the risk education and the land use priorities and the daily operations. They employ large numbers of local staff and usually have significant operational cash to support the operations of each field team. They often work in distant remote locations, often on their own, without many other agencies close by. So the recommendation to the mine action actors, to people here today, is ensure adoption and compliance with IMAS 13.1 and emerging best practice of cash and voucher assistance to deliver improved outcomes for EO survivors and high risk-taking individuals, groups and communities as a precursor to effectively leverage cash vouchers within victim assistance. And for the national mine action authorities are here to put their hand up and to ask for support in order to understand how these tools can help people that have experienced an EO accident, and agree locally appropriate levels of support to ensure that accident survivors receive that emergency medical treatment and are successfully referred into national protection mechanisms. And encourage the expansion of the function of community liaison teams to be frontline agents delivering victim assistance and risk mitigation protection services in those remote communities where they work. And encourage the investment in partnerships with cash actors to pilot approaches to demonstrate that it works, and then to take it to scale. To also consider supporting child survivors of explosive ordnance with cash directly or through partnerships to ensure that they get back to school, and that could include supporting the child themselves or including the investment in modifications of assistive advices or access as required. I think the next point is, again, unfortunately, due to the time constraints during the research, we didn't have a proper conversation with the mine action donors as to why they concentrate on land release and explosive risk education. But offline conversations usually focused on victim assistance being a mainstreamed activity and other agencies being better suited to help. Unfortunately, the evidence through this piece of research and looking in the field is that except for the ICRC and a few innovative agencies, which we must say DRC are one of them, it remains a gap in service provision in many remote areas of most of the countries where mines remain a problem, where the mine action authorities and the areas of responsibilities are placed. So hopefully the mine action donors can clarify to grant recipients how they would support resourcing the commitments laid out in IMAS 13.1, agree on a timeline with grantees from the mine action agencies to achieve compliance with their responsibilities as Section 7.2 of IMAS 13. Resource mine action agencies to deliver on those responsibilities, to facilitate or provide emergency transportation, and if possible, adopt the best practice of perhaps covering the initial first month of a subsistence allowance to allow that bridge into the humanitarian response protection network. And encourage mine action agencies to deliver or partner to deliver wider adoption of cash and voucher assistance to support survivors through the recovery and rehabilitation in areas where services are stretched or non-existent. And that could perhaps start with resourcing mine action agencies to pilot these approaches, to show to themselves that they can do it and it's not that complicated, for safer livelihoods among high-risk taking groups. So for the mainstream donors, it's a question of whether or not they're getting sufficient information to allow the explosive ordnance survivors to be prioritized. If the mainstream humanitarian community could be encouraged to increase the cause of injury data fields during this sex and age disaggregated data, beneficiary data collected by all grant recipients or in the national assessments, to proactively resource the data analysis to make it accessible to understand how important the EO survivors' needs are within the competition for supporting of other programs, and to dedicate resource allocation for those intersectoral linkages to allow victims' assistance to be covered not just by mine action donors above, and to ensure the visibility on the dimension of explosive ordnance causing excess disability in each response. If it isn't a problem, perhaps it doesn't need so much resourcing, but in a lot of cases it is, and it should be better resourced. So the next slide is on the cash and voucher assistance and protection specialists. To summarize, try to work closely with mine action operators to work out where the balance of responsibilities needs to sit. Adopt the cause of injury disaggregated data collection and analysis, and ensure adequate levels of data sharing and joint analysis between the mine actions community and the other humanitarian actors. And to design appropriate cash and cash plus interventions in collaboration with protection and humanitarian mine action partners to achieve protection outcomes for survivors as part of disability inclusive programming. Engage with mine action agencies to agree how best to assist EO survivors and high-risk taking individuals and groups through integration into ongoing or future multi-sector cash and voucher assistance, as well as cash and voucher assistance for rehabilitation and livelihood assistance. And if asked, be willing to and available to assist and train mine action actors in how to implement, operationalize cash and voucher assistance. So finally, and thankfully for everybody, I'm sure, to summarize the key recommendations, the first is to accelerate the adoption and approval of IMAS 13.1 on victim assistance and its subsequent adoption into national mine action standards, and encourage the development of agency-level standard operating procedures. Promote the policy adoption of cash and vouchers as a useful approach in victim assistance and in risk reduction programming in the mine action sector. If needed through partners or building in-country capacity. Increase the visibility of best practices in service provision to vulnerable individuals, groups and communities, and make sure that any early adoption is broadcast and shared as a not impossible development in the sector. And to step up efforts to support mine action and cash partnerships to develop those referral pathways to reach the most vulnerable areas in the challenging countries where we can work. If it can be made clear where the mine action agency's responsibilities can end, it would really help overcome many of the reasons given for not engaging at all. All of the tools and approaches are available, and realistically, in many countries, if the mine action agencies don't step in, then the survivors will continue to be underserved. I'll end here. Thanks so much for the opportunity to present this paper, and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Bill. And we'll move on. I'm sure there are lots of questions that are forming in people's minds. I would ask you to put them down in the chat. The questions that come to my mind are things to do with, are we really talking about cash within mine action, or are we talking really about greater complementarity between actions? And perhaps as an example of the latter, I'd like to turn now to Rune from the Danish Refugee Council, who will be talking about one of the facets that Bill brought up as one of his points, which is community-based rehabilitation and broader cash support to communities with the scope which goes perhaps slightly beyond victim assistance. So without further ado, Rune, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And you can hear me? Yes, great. Okay, so I'll be sharing a couple of examples from our Afghanistan program with you. Maybe we can bring up the slides. So 2 examples, and it's actually in the land release process that these examples come from. So it's not in the victim assistance process. And can you hear me, everybody? Okay, thank you. I guess the slides will come up later. But first of all, I just want to share with you a little bit on our program, because DRC is a very integrated program, both doing mine action and in Afghanistan also specialized in shelter protection and livelihoods. Cash is a modality that's actually being used in all sectors. So we have quite a lot of experience doing this. So in that sense, we're maybe a little bit ahead of the curve on that. So it's maybe been easier for us to do this than it is maybe for some other organizations. So just also to say, this is also very much from a mine action operator's perspective. I mean, I'm definitely not a cash expert. So if I'm saying something wrong, please do correct me or maybe come with a question. But our Afghanistan program has currently 652 staff, so it's also one of our slightly bigger programs, and has been there since 1999, so with a lot of capacity, and working very well together, which is definitely also something that is needed when you do these cross-sector approaches. So I want to tell you a little bit first about how we started out developing this cash modality in our mine action program. I think, again, this precursor that we have, this in-house cash experience, has definitely helped us a lot. I mean, our cash expert is also the co-lead of the cash working group in Afghanistan, so we have a lot of expertise there, and we also have fully developed SOPs for how we do cash assistance. So the process we have undertaken, and our standard process for doing this, is that first of all, our mine action teams whenever we start doing mine action, we do a joint assessment, or we do a multi-sector assessment. Our mine action team does that using, I don't know if we can go to the next slide, maybe, if that's possible. Yeah, anyways, it should be on the next slide, but I guess it'll get there. So when, yes, that's it, it's there. So if our mine action team assesses using this multi-sector assessment form or template that they use during their initial assessments, then a cache team actually comes out and does a detailed cache feasibility and appropriateness assessment. So this would be done concurrently with our own mine action teams doing their survey assessment of the area. And it's the same if another sector could be used in that area. If it's a livelihood, or if it's a shelter team, for example, or there are shelter needs that exist in those areas, then those teams can be brought in as well. And the implementation of the cache activities would happen then simultaneously or after the mine action activities have concluded. Pending needs and pending whether it's safe. I have two examples where we actually do it in different ways. But just to say that it's cache specialists that does the cache component, and it's mine action specialist, of course, that does the mine action component, obviously. So if we can have an example, that's the next slide. Of this rocket village that we are in the process of clearing at the moment, and it's been given quite a lot of international attention. Actually, there's also some good photos. This is a setup photo. That's not the way we do it with a photographer that close. Just for those who know stuff about that. But it's basically a village built by BM-21 rockets, and we of course we want to clear this because it's dangerous. There's been some accidents. Some of the walls and the floors of some of the kitchens that has opened fire has been built by using these rockets, which are of course filled with explosives. So the way we have approached it is through like a cache for shelter type of activity. So the villagers contribute their own work to this, and the cache program contributed cache for construction materials. So it's kind of a restricted type of funds transfers where it's restricted to only be used for these construction materials, but it's paid in cash. But the payment, there are like payment stages to the communities, to the individual house owners, to make sure that it's properly used. And this has of course already been agreed up front with the community, that this is the process that will happen, and they have been part of designing the process for that. But actually, it's actually, you could say that it's both a cache program, but it's also a shelter program, because we have our shelter. There's also shelter expertise, so there's a shelter engineer on site as well to ensure that the quality of the reconstruction work is up to DRC standards. So there's that component to it as well. And then if we go to the next slide, because I think I've actually stolen this slide from the presentation. Sorry about that, Bill. But I thought it's actually kind of this. I think this is kind of an interesting example of where also using cache modality actually also allowed us to access the village in the first place. So I think maybe it's difficult to see here, but it was the flow chart that Bill presented just before. And in the beginning, in this land release process, we have this community engagement and consultation, and we simply could not engage, or we simply could not get the community to allow us to tear down their houses naturally, unless they also were allowed to, or got some funds to rebuild them. So I think like using cache in this instance both allowed us to actually gain access to the work, but also of course allowed a better rebuilding and to added value. I mean, of course, it's better to have houses that are not built by rockets. I think we can conclude that. And then we also, use this engineer to build back better to a standard that's the minimum standard of the DRC shelter team. I think maybe there's a question. Is that correct? I mean, if you have questions during, then just
Well, I think we'll take.
We'll have questions after.
Take the questions at the end.
That's fine. Okay. So that's one of the examples that we have, we've so far rehabilitated 98 houses, and there's 75 remaining. So it's a project that's ongoing. So we haven't really done any end line on it. So we are still to document the exact benefits of using this cash program. But of course we know what I've said so far. Another example is actually something that we haven't started yet, but something that's planned, and that's around a water canal where there's AP, anti-personnel mine contamination surrounding this water canal. So it's not being used currently for its intended purpose, the area. But during these focus group discussions at the initial starts of the process, it was identified that the area would actually not be able to be used for its intended purpose unless this water canal was dug out and put in these concrete slabs. This is not a photo of that water canal, but how we want it to look after we're done. So we want to put in these concrete slabs as well to make sure that it continues to function. And this was identified by the community that this was a priority need, and the cash team could then also confirm that this was a need. So what we have planned for here is, which is not something that's normally done, but cash for work intervention. But in this case, it actually makes sense because we can put money into the local community instead of giving it to some contractor that comes and digs out the canal. Otherwise, cash for work is not normally an intervention used in Afghanistan, but we can also come back to that if there are more questions on that. But the idea is to hire approximately 100 people who will then, once we have completed the, and this is the timeliness in it, in this case, it would be once we have completed all of the clearance, then the cash component can come in and make sure that we rehabilitate this canal so it can be used so the land can be used for its intended purpose, which is growing almond trees and grazing livestock. And again, this is also technically supervised by a DRC engineer to make sure that the water canal is up to a certain standard. Okay, I don't have a lot of time, so sorry for rushing through this. If you have any questions, please let me know afterwards or even after this session. Okay, so cash experience, just recommendations quickly. Cash experience really required. I think this multi-sector assessment worked well. And then I think also, Tenzin, you said that this coordination between mine action staff and cash staff is required, and it's actually more difficult than you think in terms of different cultures and so on, something to work on. And then also we experience community liaison being much more effective when you can respond with several sectors. And again, this donor often funds specific sectors, but I think this is not such a huge issue for us because we can overlap different types of sectors onto one area. But of course, you need that overlap of needs. Thanks. Out of time. If there are any questions, let me know afterwards.
Super. Thanks, Gordon. We will have time, I hope, for some questions. I can see some of them are popping up already in the chat. I've taken notes of those. But I would like, before we move to questions, just to offer the floor to our final speaker, who is Kaiko Tamura from Hand in Hand for Aid and Development, to talk about protection concerns of the approach for cash and fracture assistance that they've taken in Syria. So, Kaiko, can I pass the floor to you, please? Thank you. I think you might be muted. Kaiko, could I just ask you to unmute? I don't think we can hear you.
Hello.
Hello. Super. Thank you very much for meeting. Keiko, you have the floor.
My name is Keiko Tamura, working for the organization Hand in Hand for Aid and then Development as a head of the program development and then quality assurance. I'd like to introduce our experience from the Voucher and in-kind assistance for the survivors in the Northwest Syria. Before we talk in our project, I'd like to briefly introduce about the situation in Syria. After the decade of the conflict, now in the whole of Syria, 5.6 million people to be displaced. In the Northwest Syria, where we operate, 40% of the people has some form of the disability. And then this data is only about 12 years old, and it could be higher. Among the household in the Northwest, 70% of the household has at least one member with a disability. In some cases, the household reporting two or three multiple members with a disability. They report mainly difficulty in mobility, and then vision, and then self-care. The survey conducted by UN back in December 2020, their preferred mode of the aid assistance is a cash, predominantly is a cash, in kind. As you see in the photo here, this is how people live in IDP camp inside Syria. And then most of the households with a disability face extremely challenged household financially, also hindered by the extra expenditure for the health or other needed. And among the surveyed household, the humanitarian needs are 40% is food, and then another high percentage of people asking a livelihood option and then rent or shelter. And then because people don't have enough income, they increase the debt and then, oops, am I here? Okay. Can you hear me?
You loud and clear, Keiko. Thank you.
Okay, can I continue then, yeah?
Please do.
Good. So our organization, Hand in Hand for Development, is providing survivor 2017. We try to adapt a multi-sectoral approach, providing not only the health but also other aspects of the support. Knowing extremely difficult housing financial situation, we also wanted to offer the cash support as a form of the social safety net. However, back in 2018, donor was very reluctant to engage the cash support, given a very volatile situation in the Northwest Syria. So we couldn't provide a cash, but we opted in kind or more cash in kind of cash in hand. We offered a wide selection of the item, so beneficiary can choose from pro-selected item, and the average amount is $180 per person. So we offered various options, including the basic item, disability-specific items such as wheelchair, or we also include some vocational training or skill training, or in a case if they want to restore their livelihood. So in our hope at that time, by offering a multi-sectoral choice, people can choose the very specific item to cater their specific need of the individual. However, in reality, because of the extremely difficult living condition, majority of the people, they opt for basic needs such as food basket, blanket. Only few people requested a very specific item such as diaper or portable toilet and a wheelchair. So our lesson, our experience tell us important, it can immediately can be used to back. At the same time, twin track approach will be required because survivors' need may not be matched with the family's priority. Potentially, survivor can be further marginalized within their own family, and also evidence are missing how to actually impact in the cash assistance in the decision making within the household, how to support the decision making of the individual. From our experience, we could say cash is very impactful to immediately mitigate their family's need, and then also help them make their own choices. At the same time, cash alone may not be enough to address very specific needs of the individual within the house. Item may not be locally available, transportation is not available, etc., etc. So, in a way, it is one of the lessons we learn, because the budget for my action is very limited, especially for survivor assistance. So there's a need to make the better coordination my action actor, so we can ensure survivors' family, their household could be mainstream, could be targeted with other general food distribution or general shelter project. And then, so their immediate need could be mitigated through general cash distribution. Meanwhile, my actor could offer very specific and targeted support for the individual beneficiary. It's a very brief overview from our intervention, but this is one of the things we want to say. Cash alone is not enough. We also need to modify the approach and better coordination needed with the other known. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Keiko. And we are running out of time, but I do just want to do justice to the two questions that we have had in the chat that I think we can pick up on. Bob Keeley has raised the issue of a tension, perhaps, between the provision of relief using cash as a purely humanitarian modality versus its use in supporting sustainable livelihoods or being used for those objectives. And is there a tension there? Tenzin, if I could ask you as perhaps the most knowledgeable on the cash to respond to that. And then one other question we have had is from Celine, and Bill, when we get round to it, I'd like to address this to you, and that's whether you've seen any evidence of cash potentially encouraging risk-taking behavior in mine action. So Tenzin, could I ask you to perhaps respond to the first question about this potential tension that Bob is asking about?
Sure, thank you. I'm happy to take a stab, and other colleagues might want to join. So in my opinion, there's not a tension, there's a complementarity. So we know that cash and voucher assistance is a tool, not a sector. It's a tool that can be applicable where appropriate across any type of response, whether it's multi-sector or sector specific, including within protection programming. So I see there not being a tension, but again, a complementarity between cash and voucher assistance that can, meeting basic needs directly after a crisis, as well as creating a bridge from cash assistance in the short term to sustainable livelihoods in the long term. Cash can also be one tool of livelihoods programming. I hope that addresses the question.
Thank you very much, Tenzin. And Bill, perhaps I can go to you for the second question, which is to do with whether you see cash as potentially encouraging risk-taking behavior if used in the incorrect way. And then, ladies and gentlemen, I think we will have to call it a day after that because we have run out of time. So, Bill, can I just pass the word to you to respond to the question from Celine?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there is a risk that needs to be managed, but it has been managed for a long time, and it's managed in a lot of different contexts. If the risk-taking behavior is entering a certain geographical area, a forest, you could take examples from the natural resource management sector, where providing alternative income opportunities and resourcing the startup of harvesting non-forest products or beekeeping or other activities reduce people's requirement to enter into forests to collect timber or step on a landmine or cluster munitions. So I think in the context of rural development and ongoing humanitarian response, and particularly perhaps in the legacy conflicts, I don't think there's a tension, there's a problem, as long as it's thought out. What is the prevention you're trying to encourage? What is it you're stopping? I think in Laos, they banned the harvesting of explosives, made it illegal. That helped to reduce the frequency of people harvesting explosives. It didn't stop it altogether. People are still willing to take the risks. But the provision of an alternative, that as land is cleared and farmers are allowed to return to land that is safe to farm, it's a good example perhaps of where that transition from dangerous livelihoods to safe livelihoods can be facilitated, bridged with cash for an investment in a cash project to allow people to tool up for that safer livelihood afterwards. Is that as quick as I could? Sorry, Richard.
Thank you very much, Bill. And unfortunately, I'm sure there are a raft of questions in the room, and we do not have any more time. I hope we've lifted the lid on what I think is only the start of a discussion. And if I can leave you with a thought, perhaps the discussion here is not so much about, using a certain modality within mine action, but really whether we are not actually talking about complementarity in programming in the round, and aligning sectors of programming interventions, economic recovery, mine action, protection, in a way that perhaps we've always sought to do. So perhaps this is part of a broader discussion about programming integration and complementarity. And I'll leave you with that thought. I would like to thank our speakers today very much for presenting both their cases and the research, and clearly also to the audience. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I apologize for going 6 minutes over time. I hope it's been useful, and we look forward to exploring this topic in future. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.